Welcome. We have made it to question number 3 of the Summa Theologica, and this is on the simplicity of God. And I've got to admit before I get started that this is one of the most challenging of the questions in the Summa for me to teach. I teach the Summa Theologica to high school students, and I typically preface this teaching by saying don't be disheartened. Okay, some of this is going to be deep, some of it's going to be hard to understand, but it's okay because at the same time it's also very fundamentally important. And so let me just give that caveat before we start. Don't be frustrated or disheartened if some of this is challenging, because much of the Summa is challenging, but it's also very important. All right, if you were to ask people to finish the sentence, God is, and then add a word, most people would say God is love, God is mercy, God is creator, God is good. You know, those are all great answers, right? Now, many people would say God is simple. And it's an interesting thing because we are beginning now the part of the Summa that has the 7 attributes of God. And as I mentioned in the last video yesterday, the 7 attributes take 9 questions because St. Thomas Aquinas is going to use 2 of the questions to relate God to the created world. It's really interesting when he does that, and we'll start that in a couple of days, right? But the simplicity of God is fundamental, okay? And so as we go through these 8 articles of this particular question, the Summa, I want to, first of all, tell you that probably the most important thing to understand about the simplicity of God and what exactly that means, because let's be honest, simplicity is not always a compliment. You know, if somebody said you're simple-minded or you're simple, you would think they're saying you're childish or even you're dumb, right? Simplicity, yeah, it could be great in a child, but in an adult, not so much, right? But this is the first attribute that St. Thomas Aquinas describes God, okay? This is the very first one before, you know, goodness and perfection and infinity and the ones that we're going to get to in the coming days, right? So this is important. So the most important thing to understand about God's simplicity is, first of all, well, the most important thing is that God is pure act. All right. Thomas gives a definition of God as the pure act of being. That's a great definition, the pure act of being. That means he has no potentiality. Nothing happens to God. Nothing acts on him. He doesn't move. He doesn't have passions. Which means it's very hard for us to relate to because we have all those things. We have potentiality in addition to actuality. We have passions. We get moved. We have different moods and we change our mind and things like that. So keep that in mind because it's going to keep coming back and back as we go through this. Before we get to the first article, I want to read a very brief little paragraph that Thomas starts this question with, and it's very telling. He says, "When the existence of a thing has been ascertained, there remains the further question of the manner of its existence." Okay, the existence of God, in order that we may know its essence. Now, let me tell you something very unique about St. Thomas Aquinas, is that he is going to argue that God's essence is existence. Okay, I know that sounds confusing. His essence is existence. They're like the same thing. Okay, that's going to be one of the articles we'll get to in a second, but I want to throw that out there first of all because there's no difference between God's essence and his existence. With us there is. With every other creature there is. All right, so he goes on. "Now, because we cannot know what God is, but rather what he is not, we have no means for considering how God is, but rather how he is not." All right, so this is kind of defining God by negation, saying he's so beyond us that it's hard to tell what he is, but it's easier for us to say what he's not. Okay, and that's going to come into play like right now with this first article, whether God is a body. You know, notice he didn't say whether God has a body. He says whether God is a body. This one's very simple because St. Thomas Aquinas says No body is in motion unless it be put in motion, but God is the first mover. God is the unmoved mover. Remember that? God can't move. Bodies move, bodies are acted upon, and so this is kind of a no-brainer. He doesn't have a body, so that's the first part of his simplicity. All right, is God composed of matter and form? Okay, this dog that's in the picture here has matter. It's like the fur and the bones and the blood and the muscle, right? But it also has a form. The form is kind of what defines what he is. He's a dog, okay? And that's a form. Now, when we look at that, we think dog, right? But it takes matter and form coming together in order to create a composite, or what Aristotle would call a substance. And God doesn't have parts. God can't be a form and matter coming together. So he is not composed of matter and form. This one's a very interesting question. Okay, whether God is the same as his essence or nature. Let me just briefly explain this, because if I try too hard to explain it, I'm probably just going to confuse you, all right? This bird here is an individual bird that has bird nature. Okay, it flies and has a beak and claws and things that birds have, right? And Thomas calls that a suppositum, okay, an individual thing. You know, you're a suppositum, I'm a suppositum, this pen is a suppositum, that bird's a suppositum. But because there's only one God, and there aren't many, like there are many birds and many human beings, God is his essence. God is his nature, all right? That's the best way I can explain it, but hang tight and just kind of put that in the back of your mind, and we'll move on. And because this one is what I was talking about earlier, the relationship between essence and existence. When I first read this article of the Summa, it absolutely blew me away, because God doesn't exist. Well, he does exist, but God is just not that God exists, but he is existence. Okay, think about that. He is existence. Isn't that wild? See, this tree exists. It's a suppositum. It's an individual tree. It has tree nature, okay, and a vegetative soul, which we'll get to, okay. But it is an existence, all right? It exists. It participates in existence, but God is existence. So how did God reveal himself to Moses when Moses said, hey, who are you, right? I got to go back to Egypt and tell people who sent me. And God said, I am. What I am means I am existence. I exist, I am, right? So that's the best name for God. Okay, whether God is contained in a genus. All right, when you're talking about genuses, it's the differentiation between one creature and another. And interestingly, it's Aristotle gave a lot of classification of creatures way back when, several hundred years before Jesus was born. But God is not pigeonholed into a category like you're this or that and that species and that genus. And Thomas, interestingly, says that, if he was to be in one, it would be the genus of being. And even that, he said, no, God is being, God is existence, but he's not in a genus. He's not in a category like that. All right, accidents. All right. An accident, like in this cricket here, this is a cricket. It's a suppositum. It's one individual cricket. He has cricket nature. He has the essence of a cricket. But he also has accidents, which are like his size and his color, because not every cricket is that size. Not every cricket has that color, right? So there are things that change, like I have accidents, my height, my hair color. My hair color right now is brown, but it's turning gray, so that can change, right? But God is totally immutable, so he can't have any accidents. Right? He just is. All right. Article number 7 says, and I find this interesting because he's already spent 6 articles talking about how God is simple, all right, in many different angles, and then he says, is God altogether simple? So I think he realizes this is a tough teaching, and so he's going to kind of double down here and explain it a little bit better 4 different ways. I'll read these real quickly. There is neither composition of quantitative parts in God. That's the first reason. He doesn't have parts, okay? That's simplicity. Secondly, every composite is posterior to its component parts. When a composite of matter and form comes together, well, it has parts, and it's something brought it together, and God's the uncaused cause, right? Thirdly, every composite has a cause, for things in themselves differ, can you not unite unless something causes them. God is uncaused. And then fourthly, because in every composite there must be potentiality and actuality. Remember how I started this video? God is the pure act of being. Nothing happens to him. Nothing changes him, right? So those are the four ways that God is absolutely simple. This one is interesting. Okay, they're all interesting, but this one I find particularly interesting. Whether God enters into the composition of other things. Now, remember I told you that he's going to use two full questions talking about the relationship between God and his creation, right? This is where, after all this explanation of simplicity and his existence, he's his nature, he's his essence, he's saying, well, what does that mean with regard to all of the created world? And does he enter into the composition of things? And basically what Thomas is going to say here is no, because the things in the world have their own essence, okay? A bunny rabbit has its own essence, and if God was in that bunny rabbit, well, then now God and the bunny rabbit would be acting together, and so God, it would limit God's omnipotence to be like inside of a creature, right? And that also would be pantheism. All right, that's a very common errant religious belief, is that the world is God. The world is God. That's pantheism, okay? So God does not enter into the composition of things. He gives things their autonomy. They have their own essence, their own nature, although they do participate in the existence of God and in God's nature, okay? It's really interesting. I hope this all made sense. I know this is tough, and don't give up. All right, come back tomorrow, because tomorrow we'll get into the second attribute of God, and it is his perfection. And I promise you, it's a lot easier than his simplicity. Isn't that? It's interesting to say it's easier than simplicity, but quite frankly, God's simplicity, from our perspective, is pretty complicated. That's not his fault. It's because our human nature just has a hard time grasping it. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. God bless you.